Canada just pulled off something almost nobody in Washington thought was possible. It embarrassed the United States in a trade showdown, on the global stage, in full view of allies and markets. Not China, not Russia, Canada. The same country Americans stereotype as the polite neighbor with maple syrup and hockey jerseys. And the worst part for Washington? The loss didn't come in a close fight. Trump launched what he framed as the biggest North American trade confrontation in modern times, promising it would force Ottawa to bend within days. Instead, it detonated, fast, and the pressure landed back on the U.S. economy. Then came a moment Wall Street couldn't ignore. Warren Buffett, known for staying measured and quiet, weighed in publicly in a way commentators described as a harsh economic dissection of the policy. And once you follow the chain reaction, industries scrambling, money shifting, allies recalculating, you see why economists across the spectrum aren't calling this a routine mistake. They're calling it a historic misread with a humiliating finish, because Canada didn't stumble into this. According to the transcript's narrative, they anticipated it, prepared for it, and waited. To understand how it unfolded, rewind 3 weeks. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Trump was in the Rose Garden, surrounded by trade advisors, his commerce secretary, and a wall of perfectly staged American flags, so symmetrical it looked like a set. Cameras were ready, press packed in, and Trump announced an aggressive tariff package aimed at a single allied country at a scale rarely seen in modern times. The list was blunt and sweeping. 25% on Canadian steel and aluminum, 20% on lumber, the core ingredient of American home building, 15% on dairy, agricultural goods, and auto parts, plus a 10% tariff across the rest of Canadian imports not covered above. The transcript frames the scope as enormous, over $400 billion in annual bilateral trade affected. Trump's message wasn't subtle. He spoke with the certainty of someone who believed the outcome was already locked. Canada, he said, had been ripping the U.S. off for decades. He claimed they ship lumber and oil south, take American money, and laugh about it. He pointed toward the cameras and delivered the line meant to define the moment. Canada needs the U.S. far more than the U.S. needs Canada. In his telling, the conflict would be over in a week or two. Canada would come in, deal on American terms, and Trump would call it a win. Inside the administration, the confidence was even louder. The transcript cites officials describing an internal forecast, a capitulation timeline. The idea was simple. Ottawa would make public noise for a few days, maybe a week, but the pressure would become unbearable and Canada would return to negotiate from a weakened position. One advisor reportedly summarized it with a smug certainty. Canada had no leverage. And on paper, plenty of people believed that logic. The U.S. economy is far larger. Canada sends roughly 3/4 of its exports to the U.S. Cut off access to that market, the thinking went, and Canada would suffocate. Analysts and betting markets treated a sustained Canadian resistance as almost impossible. The broader assumption was that Canada would respond the way it supposedly always does. Quietly negotiate, politely compromise, accept the reality that the bigger partner sets the terms. But the transcript makes a point here. This wasn't only economics. There was personal fuel, too. Trump and Canadian leadership had been clashing for months over NATO spending targets, disagreements on border security framing, and a public dispute around a G7 moment where Canadian officials contradicted Trump's trade deficit claims. Trump responded by attacking their leadership online, calling them dishonest and weak. So in this story, the tariffs weren't just policy. They were a public power move. Trump wanted Canada to bend, and he wanted the world to watch. What he didn't see, the transcript argues, is that Canada had been preparing for this exact scenario for over a year. So when the tariffs landed, Ottawa didn't panic. They didn't plead. They hit back. Within 72 hours, Canada announced a retaliation package that the transcript portrays as unusually precise, so focused that analysts described it as one of the most strategically designed responses in recent trade fights. Instead of randomly targeting generic American imports, Canada targeted American politics. They chose goods tied to the states Trump needed most. Kentucky bourbon, directly connected to Kentucky's political power, and a major jobs engine, Wisconsin dairy. An immediate strike into a high-stakes swing state, Pennsylvania steel. Symbolically and politically loaded, tied to the state's razor-thin electoral margins, Agricultural exports from Iowa and Nebraska, corn, soybeans, pork, right into the heartland base, and it didn't stop there. Florida orange juice, Tennessee whiskey, North Carolina furniture, Ohio manufacturing components, each one selected not because Canada needed the product, but because the political cost would land in the most sensitive districts. The transcript frames it like this. It wasn't merely an economic response, it was a political operation, built like a battlefield map, engineered to make pain visible where it matters most. But even that wasn't Canada's strongest card. The most powerful move, the part many Americans supposedly didn't understand until it was signaled, was energy. According to the transcript, Canada supplies roughly 60% of crude oil imported by the United States and about half of U.S. natural gas imports. And the pipelines that deliver that energy, named directly in the transcript, are described as vital arteries for refineries, homes, factories, and fuel supply across multiple states. So when Ottawa signaled through diplomatic channels that it could impose export levies on energy shipments, not a cutoff, not an embargo, but a calibrated tax that increases costs, the entire balance of the trade war shifted instantly. It's described as a chess moment, a hidden queen revealed. Oil markets reacted immediately. The transcript says crude prices jumped sharply in a single session. Midwest refineries, built specifically to process heavier Canadian crude, warned the White House about fuel disruptions and even shutdown risks if escalation continued, because switching supply isn't quick or cheap. You can take a hit on lumber, you can absorb higher aluminum costs, you can adjust dairy sourcing, but energy dependence is different. The transcript's message is clear. This is the leverage point that changes everything. And in this telling, Canada knew it the whole time. Trump thought he was swinging at a punching bag. Canada treated it like a strategy board. Canada's retaliation wasn't built overnight. According to the transcript, while Trump was publicly criticizing trade deficits and promising easy wins, Canadian officials were quietly traveling Brussels, Tokyo, London, Canberra, New Delhi, expanding trade relationships long before the Rose Garden announcement ever happened. They strengthened their position inside CETA, the European Union trade agreement that opens access to hundreds of millions of consumers. They deepened participation in the CPTPP, the Pacific trade bloc the United States had previously exited. They advanced a new bilateral framework with the United Kingdom. They initiated talks with India, South Korea, and Southeast Asian nations. The message wasn't loud, but it was strategic. Canada was diversifying. By the time tariffs hit, Canadian exporters weren't starting from scratch. Lumber companies had already secured preliminary contracts in Europe. Farmers had expanded agreements with buyers in Japan and South Korea. The U.S. market still mattered enormously, but it was no longer the only outlet. That decision, to diversify before a crisis instead of during one, is presented in the transcript as the turning point. Trump entered the fight assuming Canada had nowhere else to go. Canada had already built the exit routes. Then came the moment that amplified the economic consequences: Warren Buffett's remarks. At a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder gathering in Omaha, a reporter asked about the escalating trade situation. The transcript describes Buffett pausing, cleaning his glasses, a gesture familiar to those who watch him closely, before offering a response that financial networks replayed repeatedly. Trade wars, he said, are often marketed as displays of strength. In reality, he argued, they signal weakness. If a country has to threaten its neighbors to secure favorable terms, something deeper may be wrong. And if policymakers believe tariffs are paid by the other country, that reflects a misunderstanding of how tariffs actually work. Buffett emphasized a key point. Tariffs are paid domestically. Importers, manufacturers, and consumers absorb them. It isn't political theory. It's arithmetic. He went further. Over 7 decades in markets, he said he had seen policy mistakes before. But deliberately raising the cost of domestic goods, straining relationships with allies, and destabilizing supply chains while framing it as a victory was something he described as economic self-inflicted damage. The most consequential detail came next. Berkshire Hathaway had begun repositioning capital away from sectors exposed to cross-border risk. When policy becomes unpredictable, he suggested, capital does not argue, it relocates. Money flows toward stability. When asked directly about Canada's response, Buffett characterized it as patient and strategic. The side that needs the deal less, he implied, usually wins. Canada had worked to reduce its dependency. That wasn't luck. It was preparation. Meanwhile, the economic effects inside the United States began surfacing quickly. Lumber prices surged, adding significant cost to new home construction in an already strained housing market. Gas prices in parts of the Midwest climbed within days, with projections of further increases if energy levies persisted. Aluminum prices rose, affecting everything from beverage packaging to aircraft components. Auto parts crossing the US-Canada border, often multiple times during vehicle assembly, were suddenly burdened with additional charges that passed through to consumers. The average new car price increased noticeably within weeks. Estimates cited in the transcript suggested American households could face thousands of dollars in additional annual costs tied directly to tariff effects. Industries responded publicly. Ford warned that tariffs on Canadian auto parts would force price increases across its North American lineup. General Motors announced hiring freezes and delayed model launches at several facilities. The National Association of Home Builders described the lumber tariffs as effectively a tax on home ownership, projecting hundreds of thousands of families could be priced out of the market. The American Farm Bureau Federation reported billions in lost agricultural contracts within weeks. One Iowa soybean farmer appeared in a widely shared video holding canceled orders from Canadian buyers. He said he had supported the policy, believing it would help farmers, but instead he was absorbing the loss. The transcript highlights this moment as symbolic. The policy's costs were falling heavily on the same communities that had supported it. Historically, the transcript draws a comparison to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, a law widely regarded by economists as having worsened the Great Depression after international retaliation collapsed trade flows. The warning implied in the narrative is that history offers precedent for escalation and unintended damage. But beyond economics, the strategic consequences may be longer lasting. Allies watched closely. If the United States would impose sweeping tariffs on Canada, its closest trading partner, NATO ally, NORAD partner, Five Eyes intelligence member, and neighbor with the longest undefended border in history, then other nations would naturally question the durability of American commitments. The European Union accelerated trade diversification planning. Japan initiated contingency strategies for potential U.S. auto tariffs. Australia, South Korea, and the United Kingdom reportedly reassessed exposure to American trade unpredictability. Trade agreements around the world began expanding without U.S. participation. The CPTPP grew. EU trade deals deepened. New frameworks were fast-tracked. And in many of those negotiations, the United States was absent. Trust, once disrupted, is slow to rebuild. And as the transcript concludes, there was another global observer paying close attention: China. For years, Beijing has promoted itself as a stable alternative economic partner, emphasizing infrastructure investment and long-term trade commitments. The core argument has been that U.S. policy can shift sharply with political cycles, while China presents continuity. In targeting Canada, rather than a strategic rival, the transcript suggests the U.S. inadvertently strengthened Beijing's narrative. Countries uncertain about deepening ties with China now had new data points to consider. The broader implication is not partisan, but structural. Trade policy reverberates far beyond immediate tariffs. It affects capital flows, alliance credibility, supply chains, and geopolitical alignment. The transcript's closing thesis is stark. Trade agreements take decades to construct and moments to fracture. What was presented as a short, decisive confrontation became, in this telling, a lesson in leverage, preparation, and unintended consequences. And in the end, the humiliation wasn't rhetorical. It was economic, it was strategic, and it was global.